Greetings. In this video, I take step one towards getting our 2019 DragonCon Viking Pulse Raid costumes done. The shields, both of which completely handmade here. This one is my wife's. It is a 28-inch in diameter. It is made out of balsa wood. It weighs a little over 3 pounds, fully dressed. That includes the rawhide and the front and rear aluminum banding. Banding is mostly for just effect. The only thing I haven't added to these yet is the strap that we'll use to put it over our backs when we're not carrying them. This one is mine. This one is 32 inches in diameter. Solid half-inch poplar end glued planks. This shield is actually constructed, from what I can find online, closer to how shields would have been constructed, and it weighs a little over 11 pounds, which, according to much of what I read historically, this is actually about the weight that most of the shields of the time were. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not I can make it through an entire night at DragonCon with this shield. 11 pounds. It's significantly heavier than this one. Much respect to the men and women that used to fight with these things. That's a fair amount of heft. Anyways, really long video. It includes all of the steps from both shields, both the Balsa shield and the solid poplar shield. So it's a long one. So if you're inclined to sit through it, grab yourself a horn of mead and enjoy. If you're not inclined to sit through the entire thing, I will go through and put bookmarks in the first comment section below, so that you can skip around if you only want to see the metalworking, or if you only want to see the shield boss, or you only want to see the poplar planks, or whatever. Anyhow, enjoy it, and hopefully you're able to find something useful in the video. Have a great day. So I started my builds in the middle, and I took a couple guesses based on the shield size that I was after, and made two pieces of circular aluminum, and then I dished my shield boss as a normal Viking shield boss would have been raised. You'll have to look that up on your own. But I dished it. I didn't have the knowledge or the tools necessary to raise the shield bosses, and I made mine out of aluminum instead of iron, simply because that's what I have, and that's what and in the end, they're props. They turn out fairly lightweight. Cut a couple of circles, and then basically beat them into a dome. They're not quite as deep as a normal shield boss would be, but there's plenty of room in there for my hand, or my wife's hand, on her shield. So I wasn't all that concerned about being exact. They're costume props. Anybody not familiar with the dishing process? What I did was marked a couple of reference lines, and then put it in what they call shrinking stump, and then took a ball peen hammer and a old wooden t-ball bat that I've turned around, and I used the t-ball bat for beating on aluminum a lot. I find that it doesn't scar up or tear the aluminum if I get too aggressive. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm a complete and total amateur metalworker, so somebody who knows what they're doing could probably do this in half the time and do twice as good a job, but I may do it. It may just take me a little longer. But there's the shrinking stump, and there's the t-ball bat, and so basically what I do is I just beat this thing until it's a little bit of a dome, and then the edges tuck up like that, and then every so often I will lay it flat and beat the edges in, and when I do that, it shrinks the edges around on each other, and that starts to give it the dome pattern. Now's where I get to cheat. I've actually got a machine, or several machines, that help with this process a little along the way, but for the most part, this is how shrinking is done. And using one of my reference lines, I put the piece up against my welding table and beat the flange over, and this is where I'm going to drive the hardware through the shield boss that secures it into each shield. Now, normally these would be connected with iron nails that go through the shield and bend over on the other side. I didn't want any sort of chance of sharp objects or anything like that, scratching, cutting, poking, or doing any of that funny stuff. So I am going to secure mine using a combination of chemical adhesive, glue, epoxy, or something like that, and then
fasteners, mechanical fasteners that are too short, so it won't be technically 100% accurate, but it'll be close enough. Once I've got everything beat into shape, a trip to the pneumatic planishing hammer, and it reasonably smooths everything out. I didn't go looking for a nice clean finish. I wanted something that looked hammered and worked on. These would have been created by a blacksmith. They would have been tooling marks and stuff like that. So I wanted to leave it some semblance of rough finished. And then I just marked out the holes where I will put the fasteners down the road. In this process, as I mentioned before, there are two different shields. One of them is made out of what started out as 3/4 inch solid poplar planks, and the other one is made out of 1/4 inch pieces of balsa wood laid opposite grain and glued together between the layers, called plied. This particular one is the poplar shield. I cut the pieces into approximate dimensions, longer in the center, shorter to the edges. I drew center lines on all of the pieces. I think there ended up being a total of 6. Basically, I marked the halfway thing. Then we ran them through a planer. According to my research and stuff like that, most of these shields were about 1/2 inch in thickness. And I couldn't find 1/2 inch poplar, so I went with 3/4 inch and then planed it down, basically removing material from the face. Once I had them down and reasonably sized, I then edge glued the planks. Edge glued is exactly what it sounds. I put glue along the edges and laid them to end and clamped them together, and once they were clamped together, I left them overnight for the glue to get good and tight bond. When I had that done, I moved on to the balsa shield. I picked up the balsa wood from Amazon, and I bought 2 packages of 10. I calculated I was going to need 9 per side. I ended up actually using a few less than that. We laid out a piece of drywall, just a scrap piece of drywall my dad had laying around, and covered it with paper, and then we laid out the first layer of balsa, soaked it down with glue. I mean, just made sure that every square inch of the wood was glued. And then as we were moving along, we'd actually glue the edges as well. So not only is it glued between the plies, but it's glued along the edges. And these are 1/4 inch thick pieces, so the edges didn't have a whole lot of grip, but did the best we could. Once we had a nice, good, thick layer of glue, we then laid the top pieces on with the grain going the opposite direction. This will give a fragile, frail, soft wood hopefully a little bit more strength. And it actually worked out fairly well. It's reasonably sturdy and incredibly lightweight. Cleaned up the glue, smashed it together, clamped everything, and let it sit overnight with the other one. I came in the next morning, unclamped everything, and checked to make sure that we didn't have any sort of major failure with the adhesive. And everything looked pretty good, so we marked the center and then drilled a hole. And that's where we will put the dowel for the jig that lets us cut a circle with the bandsaw. Here's the jig for the bandsaw, set at 16 inches for the poplar shield, the slightly larger of the two. Once the dowel is set and the shield is in place, we turn the bandsaw on and slowly spin the shield, and it cuts out a nice, neat little circle. We drilled the hole and punched the dowel through the balsa shield, and then we were a lot less aggressive with material. Now, a lot of material needed to come off this shield to get it to the 28 inches, but we weren't sure how the balsa wood was going to cut or what was going to happen, and we wanted to make sure that if we made a mistake, we had some place to go to repair it. So what we did was we crept up on the shield before we actually had it in the diameter. Took us a couple extra minutes, but the balsa wood is so soft that the bandsaw just cut right through that thing. Once we had those done, we scribed out a hole in the center for the shield boss. This is where your hand will go through and the front will be covered. Drilled a couple of holes, stuck the jigsaw through there, and cut out the inner circle. The handle on both shields is a solid poplar strip that I also picked up at Lowe's when I picked up the material. It's essentially, we just laid it out on the shield, marked where the center areas were going to be, figured out about where we wanted it to fall on the length of the shield. Now, there's some suspect that these may have been one of the primary things that held the shields together, so we wanted to make sure that they were long enough that they'd cut across all the plies, at least partially. Once we had them cut to size, we laid out a loose taper so that they're narrower at the ends and thinner at the ends. Then used the little saw that we had, or little sander we had, to cut down the edges, and then cut the taper out on the bandsaw. Rolled over a couple of pieces of round rod that I had into D-esque type rings and stuck those underneath the handle, and these will be the leather straps where when we're not actually holding the shields we can sling them on our back and carry them. I wanted these to be durable enough that they could hold my shield up, and I built them out of scrap material, so I just figured it was easier. And then welded the ends together, cut grooves in the handles, and basically captured them when I attached the handles to the shield. On the Balsa shield, the handle is held in place exclusively with glue. The shield is light enough that I'm not worried about it coming apart, and I didn't really want to take a chance on fastening anything through this. I may change my mind on this later and go back and fasten it, but for right now, I just glued it and then clamped it and let it sit overnight. So far, it seems to have held really, really well, hopefully. The Poplar shield is a lot heavier. The Balsa shield weighs under 3 pounds. The Poplar shield weighs over 11, and I didn't want to take a chance on just trusting chemical adhesive. And this shield had a little bit of a bow. So I clamped it to my welding table to try and straighten out the bow before I put the handle on. Then put down a pretty thick layer of glue, glued the handle to the shield, and then drilled holes, pilot holes, for 6 drywall screws, and I countersunk them so that you couldn't see them when the shield was together. Each end of the D-rings is held in place with a drywall screw, and then right up by the handle where the shield boss will be. I figure if the glue fails, the screws will hold, and that way I don't ever have to worry about this 11-pound shield coming off of my back or breaking loose while I've got a hold of it and I'm holding it. Safety first. The backsides of both shields are strapped with 16-gauge aluminum. These are almost exclusively visual. They really don't do a whole lot for the shield. I took a piece of aluminum, I broke it into a reasonable square, cut them into 1 and a quarter inch sections, I think it was, marked a center line, and then bead rolled a raised edge on all 4 of them, 2 per shield, and really the bead rolling is there to add a little bit of visual effect and to strengthen the aluminum just a little bit. Aluminum's pretty flimsy, so by itself these straps would have been completely useless. With the bead roller in them, they're just slightly less useless. Once I had them bead rolled, I gave them a good sand, trimmed the edges into some semblance of round, then sanded those so that they were nice and smooth. Gave them a good coat of primer and then Rust-Oleum hammered black. And the Rust-Oleum hammered black is what I used on all of the metal for these shields, trying to reproduce the iron look. It didn't work, but it's what I've got and it's what I'm going to stick with. And then I drilled holes where they will eventually fasten to the shield. My wife really liked the curved front profiling on some of the shields on the show Vikings, and so she wanted me to do that if it was possible. I had originally planned on just using straight pieces and laying them out in quadrants, but hey, you know, the curve wasn't that big of a deal, so I laid a straight line out on just on a piece of paper that was a reproduction of the shield. Found a design that I sort of liked, cut out a 28-inch piece and a 32-inch piece, and that number is strictly reference to the size of the shield. I store all of my patterns and templates in case I ever have to go through and remake something for whatever reason. So cut them out, traced them onto aluminum, and then I essentially did the same thing with the bead roller. I bead rolled a section down the middle, again, to give them a little bit more profile and to give them a little bit more strength, just in case. cut these things out on the bandsaw, sanded them while they were flat, and then laid them out on the shield to make sure that they were the right length. When I cut them, I knew that they were going to be a little long. I essentially just laid out the shield boss and traced around where I wanted them to end so that they'd end right up against the shield boss. Then I measured back an inch at the top and a half inch from the bottom. Actually, I think that's backwards. But anyways, I measured out and then just traced a curved line, stuck them up in the bead roller again, and gave them a profile just like I did with the backstrapping pieces. Once I had them all bead rolled, I beat them with the body hammer for two purposes. One, the bead roller kind of curves them a little bit, so this straightened them back out, and it nicked them up and dinged them up and made it look like battle damage. Like they get hit with swords and axes and stuff like that, so I didn't want them to be nice and smooth. I usually leave color decisions to my wife because if I was painting based on my color taste, everything would be black. But she picked out the colors for the tunics, and they are as close to proximity to this blue and green as we could get. And we went to Lowe's and picked up some semblance of paint that was close, laid them out in quadrants, and with a little bit of help from Bellatrix, I got the quadrants painted blue and green and one kitty paw painted blue. And for the Poplar shield, I just put everything in place where it needed to be and proceeded to pound in thousands and thousands of these little shoe tacks that I bought on Amazon. They don't go all the way through the shield. They're just barely, but they're sturdy enough that they hold, and they look decent. They slightly resemble iron nails, but other than that, just not too much. After I hit my finger for the 7th or 8th time, I started using a pair of pliers to hold them. And I made a mistake and put the shield boss on first. I should have put all the flat pieces on and then put the shield boss on, but you live and learn. And onto the Balsa shield, this is me learning. I put the shield boss on after I had all of the backstraps in place. This entire shield, all of the metalwork and stuff like that is held in place with glue. The grain, as I've mentioned before, is just too loose and light to actually hold a tack or a nail. So I made sure everything got glued and then just clamped and or weighted down and sat overnight. I glued the nails, the tacks, as I was putting them in, hoping that maybe that would help also hold things in place. We'll see. And with the shield boss glued and nailed in place, I laid out the separating sections, the metal front strap pieces that cover over the quadrants. And did the same thing, glued everything, soaked the nails in glue, and then drove them in. Most of them I was able to drive in with my fingers. A few of them I actually had to pound in. And once I had all that stuff glued and nailed down, I put a whole bunch of weights on top of stuff and then just set it aside and let it dry overnight. So I went to Walmart and picked up what turned out to be a grand total of 4 and change of these $3.99 rawhide dog bones. Soaked them in water for overnight, took them apart. Now, what I discovered about the rawhide dog bones is that they're inexpensive, they're handy, they're fairly easy to work with, but they're really, really inconsistent in the thickness of the material. Now, some of the rawhide that I got was really, really thin, and it was almost easy to tear, and other rawhide was real Viking shield quality stuff. I mean, it's thick, it's durable. I was impressed, but the quality's kind of spotty. So if you're looking for something real quality, you may want to go ahead and order rawhide strips from Tandy or something like that. But if you're just looking for looks like I did, then use the dog bones. They're cheap. I cut them into 2-inch widths. This metal ruler that I use is exactly 2 inches wide, so I just laid it on top of the piece of rawhide, cut it out with the rotary cutter, and then stretched it out over the shield. What I found the easiest thing to do was I would put the first 2 in at the start of the strip, and then I would work the front edge all the way around, and then I'd flip the thing over and start working on the back. For the Balsa shield, I was able to drive the furniture tacks that I used in with my fingers, and I didn't have to beat it with a hammer or anything like that. And I think I used 4 packs of furniture tacks on the Balsa shield and 9 on the Poplar shield, and there's 50 per. When I started to get to the edge of an old strip, I left a little bit of room to overlap the rawhide, and then I start the next strip on top of the old strip and just drive a pin through both pieces. And when this stuff dries, it's gonna stretch and be solid. But for the most part, I was able to get a nice, clean, uniform finish on the front. Very few puckers and buckles. The back on both shields has a little bit, but sometimes that happens. On the Poplar shield, I was not able to drive these in with my fingers, and they were actually tough, and they would fold over, they'd break, they'd bend. They were a little bit more obnoxious, but I drove quite a few of them in and spaced them. Instead of using every 4 or 5 inches like I did on the Balsa shield, I used them about every 2 inches, simply to hold everything in place. So I just basically lined the entire edge, and when that was done, I set them aside to dry.